agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Sturt.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to start by commending my colleague, the member for Nichols, who's made an exceptional contribution on this bill. In fact, I fear I'm at risk of repeating many of his fine arguments in my own contribution. And of course, I rise to speak in favour of the member for Fairfax's second reading amendment. As has been made very clear, we in the Coalition do not support this Labor version of the guarantee of origin position that we, of course, when we were in government, had a very different scheme that we would hope to be supporting through this parliament. But regrettably, what has been brought forward by the government is vastly different to what we intended to do when we were in government. And that is regrettable, because a proper guarantee of origin scheme would be an excellent thing for this country, and what is being proposed in this bill is a lost opportunity to give that certainty and that opportunity to so many industries that would be looking for the system that we intended to legislate for. I'd like to start by giving a shout-out to the HILT CRC that are coordinated via the Adelaide University. I've had a lot to do with them over the years, met with them when they were applying, and happily they were successful under the previous government through the CRC funds to get support. HILT stands for the Heavy Industry Low Emissions Transition, CRC, and so they are doing work on trying to crack some of the challenges that are in place when it comes to the industrial chemistry and the commercially viable technology to undertake some of those very high-emitting heavy industry processes. We obviously know that getting to net zero is much more than just making sure that the energy that's generated and zapped down the transmission lines of this country, getting that to net zero through zero emissions technology is nowhere near enough to address the totality of emissions. And one of the big ones that's probably got one of the most challenges is those industrial processes, those heavy industries that emit a lot, that is very difficult to replicate those processes from a 240-volt power connection. So I think this figure is still accurate, but it's certainly been the case for a long period of time that 7% of total emissions comes from steel alone. And I think cement's about 5%. And these other really important industries for our country, for the planet, but particularly for our country, like steel and cement and aluminium, obviously at the moment are very high in emissions, and we've got to come up with commercially viable solutions to address how they can become carbon neutral. Now, in my home state of South Australia, the state government are putting a large amount of state government funds into building a hydrogen plant in the Iron Triangle. Now, I wish them well, but there are some early, very concerning signs about how that project is tracking and where it is going to end up, particularly from a cost point of view, and whether or not the markets that were believed to potentially be accessible to that plant once it is constructed, whether those markets will indeed exist in the form that was envisaged by Labor when they developed this scheme. And it now seems that the timelines that were promised, they can't be concealed from the public. You know, if you are or are not successfully building a hydrogen electrolysing plant, so the timelines on that commitment are running dramatically late. But what isn't known in the public domain is just where the financial situation, the cost of that plant, has landed, because it was many hundreds of millions, around $500 million, I think, was initially earmarked by the Labor government in South Australia to build that plant. But I have deep concern, and I think any reasonable observer would have deep concern, that not only the delays to that, but also the likely cost blowouts for building that plant seem to be likely to be quite significant. And if they weren't, you would think there'd be a lot more transparency around what is happening with that project from the state government's point of view than there currently is. In fact, there were attempts, I believe, to establish a select committee in the Legislative Council to look into that project, and that was that was blocked. So the transparency around what's happening there is extremely concerning. And I think the dreams of what might be possible and when for hydrogen at that plant that the South Australian government is building is pretty well replicated across all of the hoped-for hydrogen developments across this country and really across the world. And there was a lot of early hype around what and where hydrogen might lead to, but regrettably a lot of boardrooms are making a lot of decisions to cancel a lot of investments in hydrogen projects and infrastructure around hydrogen, because it seems to be the case that the sort of market that some believed might develop in a certain time frame is not indeed eventuating. And some of the major partners, particularly in Japan and South Korea, who seemed to be very enthusiastic around hydrogen produced in Australia for their markets, are not quite as enthusiastic as they have been in the past. So here we have before us a bill that we're discussing that could be very different to what it is that the government's brought to us, and that's regrettable because the huge focus that they've got on green hydrogen through this is not panning out to have the same likelihood of significant success that some believed it would in the previous years. Now, look, as the member for Fairfax points out in the amendment to the second reading, we have a significant criticism around the fact that this is not a technology agnostic proposal. And we have obviously made a decision in the coalition that there is no prospect of getting to a net zero by 2050 circumstance in this country without nuclear reliable baseload generation, which is obviously also, of course, emissions-free. And that as we see the coal generation, as the member for Nichols pointed out, which completely underpinned the industrial development of this country for many, many decades, as we see the retirement of that reliable baseload generation, we want to see that replaced by an equally reliable baseload generation being nuclear power. And indeed, nuclear can be a huge part not only of generating electricity to go through our electricity market and power our homes and businesses, but of course nuclear has enormous applications across the other elements and challenges of getting to net zero. The heat produced from nuclear is a big opportunity for certain industrial processes. Heat that can be created out of nuclear is very superior to what you can create from a three-phase power electricity powered heat capability. And even with nuclear heat, there's heat requirements in the industrial chemistry of certain heavy industries that not even nuclear can create. And those are challenges that need to be cracked, and people like the Hilt CRC are working on exactly that, because at the moment there is no real commercially viable non-carbon emitting alternative. That's why we recognise that there will be some processes that will always emit carbon, and we need to accommodate the need to offset emissions. Net zero isn't absolute zero. Net zero is net zero. And there will undoubtedly be processes in certain industrial transformation that the emissions from that need to be offset, because there's no solution other than continuing to undertake chemical reactions that release carbon. None of that is accommodated in this bill. And I have my friend, the member for Braddon here, a proud Tasmanian, and one of the most egregious things in this bill is that the legacy hydropower generation capacity, like those that are resplendent throughout the great island of Tasmania, is for some bizarre reason excluded from being eligible for this scheme. Now, that surely is an oversight. I can't possibly imagine why hydropower— I concede the government's got an ideological objection to nuclear. I've not identified that they've got an ideological objection to hydropower, or certainly not in the modern era. I know there was a time when dams in Tasmania had a degree of controversy for different reasons to emissions reduction, but existing hydro-powered plants that have serviced Tasmania and in fact export that great clean energy across Bass Strait to Victoria, the fact that they're excluded from this scheme is just nonsensical. And hopefully that's something that the government recognises, and if they're not prepared to consider other points, at least, don't do this to the poor people of Tasmania. Obviously, the other thing that we think is very odd, where we need as much international interoperability as possible, because getting to net zero is a global effort, but it's also going to involve a lot of cooperation and collaboration between other economies. We've got a situation where our scheme doesn't align with the one that's been designed for the EU and the UK. So under our Guarantee of Origin scheme, if it passes this parliament, that won't be compatible with the schemes in the EU and the UK. So that's greatly disappointed, because that's enormously opportunity lost for Australian businesses that see an export opportunity potentially if we had a scheme that was aligned with the EU and UK one and accredited to that. There would be businesses that would be operating under our scheme that would also have an opportunity to access markets in the EU and UK with that accreditation through our Guarantee of Origin scheme, if it was properly aligned with those overseas ones, and the proposal here from the government does not. So that, of course, concerns us. And most importantly, we have a very credible concern that this is the beginning of creating something akin to the previous carbon tax regime that the Gillard government introduced. And certainly this bill heads down that path and provides a mechanism for putting a price on carbon again, and that is something that the Australian people have spoken very comprehensively on. And indeed, if the government believes that that would now be popular, they're very welcome to take that to an election and have it as a central campaign position. But to bring through this legislation a mechanism that could well open the government up to putting a price back on carbon by stealth again, we bell the cat on very, very much in this debate, and that is what the member for Fairfax is doing through the second reading. So, Deputy Speaker, it is regrettable that this is a lost opportunity to have a bipartisan bill that would have been able to continue on from the work that we did in our last term and create something that would provide certainty for Australian industry and, of course, be agnostic to the great opportunities that we look forward to presenting to the people of Australia at the upcoming election around technologies like nuclear. And that is very regrettable that, again, the government are not open to the people having their say on a matter like that through this legislation. And so, indeed, I support the second reading amendment from the member for Fairfax. We don't support this bill for all the reasons outlined, and I commend the member for Fairfax's amendment to the House.